Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Ceccarelli, founder of the It's Time To organization. Welcome to It's Time to Talk. Today we're going to talk about some of the issues that are facing kids and parents as far as anxiety, depression, and the uncertainty of returning to school with the COVID crisis as it is today. So joining us today are our panelists, Dr. Kelly Blankenship, Chief of Psychiatry at Dayton Children's Hospital, Lisa Helm, mental health counselor in our community, Arlene Petty, who's a middle school counselor, and Rita Tilton, adjunct professor at the University of Dayton. Right now, as you know, there is a lot of discussion among different school districts about what the best plan is to return their children safely to school. Let's go back to a discussion we had with the panelists just a couple days ago, and you can hear what their thoughts are. So let me start by asking the clinicians here and people who have practice in the community, what are you seeing in your practices now as far as anxiety or depression or things that students are voicing concerns about returning to school?
So what I hear a lot about is the kids are there's a lot of depression just from having to stay inside and not being able to do their normal activities. Some of the kids are starting to be able to go back and do some of their sports, but some aren't. And so a lot of kids, that's a lot of what they were looking forward to and what's fun about summer. And so a lot of them are missing that. There's, I think, a lot of anxiety about going back to school, but not necessarily because they are worried they themselves could get sick with COVID. There's a lot of kids that voice a lot of concerns that they're going to get COVID and bring it home to their families. And they have a lot of the kids are concerned that then they're going to give it to their parents or their grandparents. And so then their parents or grandparents are going to get sick. And so that's where I'm seeing a lot of the anxiety stemming from. What are your thoughts?
I think that and really the social isolation, particularly for those kids who have a family member who is in the home and is ill, and seeing their friends being able to do things, because we don't all deal with this in the same way. Some parents have more anxiety, some parents have less. So they're seeing their friends do things that they're not able to do. There's also, uncertainties about, am I going to be able to do my extracurricular activities? And if I can't do that, then I don't want to go back to school, because the social things are so important to them. And for some are the main reason that they go to school.
Well, and I think you hit on something, just the uncertainty in general. I think that most people feel okay if they can figure out how to plan for the future. But I think what COVID has done is open kind of this can of worms where adults are having trouble planning. And I think when adults have trouble planning or get anxious, that'll spread down to the kids, because nobody really knows what to expect in this time. And I think that's causing adults and children anxiety.
Well, and we know that anxiety comes from thinking a lot about things that we don't have control over. And, we don't have control over the virus. And we don't have control over what it might be next week. Schools, 1 week they're going to do this, but then next week they're like, oh no, we're not sure we can do that. So we really have to try to, as parents, focus on the what is right now. And if this is what it is right now, then this is what we're doing. And these are our thoughts about it, and try to really stay away from that what if.
No, I think that's great. And I think too, when you can have a plan and you can share that plan with your kids, I think that they feel more reassured, because I think one of the big things, like you said, about anxiety is the uncertainty and the unknown. But if you can at least have a plan for what right now is, then I think that helps a lot with the anxiety and helps the kids feel like, okay, at least, we know what we're doing right now. So.
And I think sometimes, too, it also is about including the kids in the conversations, so that it's not this is what's happening, this is what we're doing, but what are your concerns and what are we going to do as a family? I've had some families go on vacation, and they've really had to do that, because it's hard to explain to a child, well, you haven't been able to go to school, but we're going to go on this vacation, and why that's safe. But they were able to talk to the kids about what we can do as a family to make sure that we minimize our risk. And that helped the kids, because they knew what was going to happen, and that it was going to be different than last year's vacation.
Yeah, they all are right now. I think, too, the older the kid, I think I think you're so right. The older the kid, the more important that is, because with teenagers, they really do need to be part of the conversation, because this stuff is real and it's happening. And the more they're part of the conversation and feel that their voice is heard, the more they're going to feel comfortable, less anxiety, feel like they're part of the plan, part of the solution.
And sometimes as parents, we think our kids are worried about one thing, but that's really not what they're worried about. And so if we don't include them in the conversations, we might be addressing something completely irrelevant to them.
Yeah, and I think that's, a good point too, is making sure that you're having that open conversation with your kids. Because it's amazing what they'll tell you when you sit down and you let them talk and you kind of let them lead the conversation. It's amazing, what they'll reveal. And once you know what their thoughts are and what they're anxious about or what they're not anxious about, it really helps you move things in a direction that's going to help them feel better.
Right.
So what I'm hearing, though, is almost two separate issues. One is the uncertainty of going back to school in light of the COVID. And maybe we'll elaborate a little more with Rita and Arlene about how the school districts are putting out different proposals. But the other one that I thought I heard was you mentioned specifically, Lisa, that an important part of kids returning to school is the socialization and extracurricular activities. And so how as a parent do you prepare your student to go back to school not knowing whether there's going to be fall sports or they're going to be able to participate in clubs that they normally like to participate in? How do you start that discussion with them?
I think you start it by discussing and the fact that we don't know. And that is what the reality is right now. And we're just going to take it one day at a time, because for some of those kids, there may be social activities offered, but their parents may not want them to participate for a variety of reasons. So having those discussions and helping the kids understand that when we know more, we'll have the conversation, rather than, and even clarifying to them that there might be things that you can't participate in because of our family situation, so that they're not going into it thinking or having the thought that if it's offered, I'm going to get to do it.
I think it's nice too to consider, if this isn't going to be available or if you can't do this because of our family situation, let's talk about some other things you could do.
Right.
A lot of times extracurricular activities, they're great because they build self-confidence, they teach kids teamwork, they do a variety of things for kids. And they give them a lot of times coping skills, something to do with their time, distraction, those kinds of things. And so I think, maybe they can't do that activity, but maybe there's something virtual you can do. Maybe there's a club that's meeting virtually and we can still do that. And so, talking with kids about what other interests do you have? If this one isn't going to work, what are B, C, and D? And so then sometimes I think that can help, just so that they know, well, if this one's off the table, there's at least some other options.
So it really sounds important to me to have a family discussion and not to just assume that when students go back to school, they're going to be able to pick activities, do them as they wanted in the past, based on some of the concerns you may have as a family unit, correct?
Well, and not even just in the lines of COVID. I think that there are some families out there that have said, oh gosh, the life we lived before was really chaotic, and we've learned that we don't want to do that anymore, so we want to have more balance. And so your kids need to be a part of that discussion too. Because some families may say, gosh, we've learned something that our family does better with a different kind of situation.
Yeah, I've heard that quite a bit, actually. People saying that, our kids were involved in so many things and we were always gone doing all these things, and that now we're actually spending quality time together as a family. And so, like you said, I think those are good conversations to have.
So something positive may have come out of this.
Yeah.
So Rita and Arlene, they discussed the concern that is on everybody's mind, and it seems like it changes every day. What should parents consider when we're talking about sending kids back to school in light of this uncertain COVID situation moving forward? Can you guys elaborate on the options that students and parents have and how they should come to a conclusion on what's best for their child?
I think we're going to see school districts, many of them offering a virtual academy and kids attending school. But that part is going to be very tentative. So I think just having conversations with your kids about, let's look at virtual school and let's look at attending school live. What are the pros and cons of those things? What would you like about continuing to work online at home versus what are the things that would be really attractive to you going back to school and knowing that school would look different than it did before. So I think those are some things to think about. And I know, Arlene, you're still right in the midst of it, but I think you need to check out the website that your school district has so that you can get the latest information and updates about alternatives and about what they're looking at. And also, Ohio Department of Education's website is very helpful. They are really looking at what's happening across the state. So just becoming informed for parents, I think, is a very important thing. And then starting to talk to your kids about what would this look like and what would be the pros and cons versus what this would look like. But keeping in mind that attending school is still up in the air.
And I would even add to that, based off of what type of learner your student is, what option might be best for them, rather that in class setting with the teacher present, and or can they work a little more independently to do online studies, and that differs by student. And certainly, you know, with the information that districts are getting from the Dayton and Montgomery County Public Health, from the Ohio Department of Education, all of those things are playing into the decisions about what type of school year, what it will look like starting out for that first semester. And so definitely checking your district website is the best way to stay on top of that.
And don't you think, too, being aware as parents, if the choice is given, what can we do to support our kids if they're virtually attending school? Are we in a better position to work with them at home versus if it's offered, would the option of live school, going to school and being in a somewhat regular situation, not really regular, but in the live setting, is that something that might work for us too? I think parents have to realize that this is a year that their involvement with schools and collaboration with schools is so important. It's not going to be ideal.
Right. And that's, you know, when we first started this venture with online learning in March, one of the things I kept reminding students of is that change is difficult for everyone. But out of change usually comes growth. But what also happens is we learn something about ourselves in that process. So what did they learn about themselves in terms of their commitment, their level of follow through, their ability to log on and do all those sorts of things when we had the trial run in March may play into the parents' decisions about what it will look like for them in August.
So let me elaborate on that a little bit and just ask, do either of you think it really matters as far as the age group that they could do as well from home with virtual learning versus needing to go to school to get the socialization and the interactive skills that they may need as far as socialization? Do you think there's an age group that does better or would do better at home?
I would say what Arlene had talked about earlier is it's really an individual situation, but regarding ages, I think all kids can benefit from social interactions with their peers and with their teachers in a live setting. So I think that's going to be a real compromise if kids are virtually educated. I think that younger students are going to need a lot more supervision with the virtual work that's offered. So that's really something for parents to consider versus a high school student who can work much more independently than a first or second grader.
I would agree. And I too, I think, there's the benefit of the exchange of discussion
Yes.
and ideas in a classroom setting that's very different virtually. I know kids who commented some loved the virtual learning time that they had, and others absolutely could not stand it. They
Sure.
wanted to be back in the classroom. They wanted to see their teachers. So I don't know that there's an age that's best. I just think it's hard to replace the value of what they get with that face-to-face
Yes.
in a classroom versus.
So this kind of goes hand in hand with what we were talking about earlier about having that family discussion as parents with your student, pointing out the pros and cons of online versus face-to-face learning and what environment your student may thrive in as opposed to struggle with.
Well, I
correct?
think something to think about too is families, individual families. And so I think there's some families where if one of the children were to catch COVID and bring it home, that could be a lot more detrimental than to
Yes.
a different family. And I think the other things I think about too is that when you have the little guys, the kindergartens, first, second, third grade, they don't do a great job keeping their hands to themselves. They don't, they don't do a great job of not, blowing their nose, their tissue, and then touching everybody they can find. And so, I think that's just something to consider if you're a family where COVID could be very detrimental coming home. It's something I think about. So
Sure.
I have little kids.
I think it's also important, though, as a family, when you're having that discussion that, like you said, focusing on the pros and the cons of the different situations. But it's important for parents to not let their own anxieties come into play, so that the kids don't pick up on that, because they will. And we know that there's that connection between really anxious parents and kids that we see that have anxiety.
Right.
So you have to be able to have the discussion on more of a factual, and this is what is
Yes.
versus this is how I'm feeling about it.
The more anxious parents are about it, the more anxious the kids will be.
Right.
Because it's just kind of modeling that this is something we need to be anxious about and this is something we need to worry about. And I think, I think it is something that we need to know about and we need to be smart about. But if you
Right.
model that anxiety, then the kids will pick up on that and start to show it as well.
And I think too, most people are anxious about this. We don't like this lack of control and lack of schedule and lack of predictability for ourselves or for our children. And so conveying to our kids, this is hard for us too. We're worried about it. We don't like the uncertainty of it, but we're going to get through this. And if you are a parent who has a tendency to be anxious about such things, and rightfully so in many situations, I think the important thing would be to try very hard not to convey that to your kids, to kind of check that before you begin the discussions with your kids, because they're looking for a reaction from their role models, and that will set into play their own reaction and response to how they're going to deal with it. So again, I think just reminding kids, yes, this is really tough. We have to make so many compromises and changes right now, but it's not forever, and we're going to get through it. And that's why we're going to have a lot of conversations about this, not just about the school part, but just the day-to-day things. I think those are real key points for parents to consider, to kind of get in touch with where you're at and then almost plan how you're going to talk with your kids, trying to keep your own emotions in check a little bit.
I think that's good advice, because one of the things that I've always felt was that your children are looking at you for guidance in times of crisis. And we're in a time of crisis, face it, we are. Not only with COVID, but a lot of other things going on in our communities right now. So I think the more that we can convey a sense of calmness, a sense of realism, and portray that to our children that, look, we're under control as best we can be given the circumstances, then I think you can have a better conversation with your children rather than talking very emotionally, which they're going to pick up on and they're going to react to. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and there's no doubt that you need, as an adult, you need someone that you can have that conversation
Yes.
with. But when you say check it at the door, it's really reminding yourself that my children are not those people.
Right.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
have to have my own people, whether it's a spouse or a parent or a friend or whatever.
Right.
And so being able to identify who that person is, and being able to have a conversation with them before you have those conversations with your kids.
Okay.
I think too with COVID, there are, I think, ways to really be smart about it. There's masks, there's our social distancing, 6
Yes.
feet
Right.
apart. See,
Here we are.
there's, I think, there are ways to be smart about that, and I think that can help with anxiety too, knowing that, it's a virus, it spreads, but there are ways to contain it and being smart about that, and this is how we do that, and I think that can help and go a long way too.
It brings that control piece into play a
Yep.
little bit when so many things are out of our
Yes.
control. Talking to your kids and even realizing as adults, there is so much we can't predict, but these are some things we do have control over, and conveying that to kids. And even sometimes, and this is really not so much related to school, but just the day-to-day piece, what are some things that we can do as a family, projects that we can do? This is historical, and one of the things I was thinking about is families getting together and journaling and writing and drawing about this and making their own family journal. This is how we experienced COVID-19 and how we as a family navigated it and got through it. I think that can really, again, give us something to do and a little bit of control over the situation that we don't have much control over at all.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think
And
that's
a lot
great
of
one.
school districts are sharing websites and information with parents about how to talk to your children
Yes.
about COVID. I think what you mentioned earlier in regards to let the child pose the questions, because sometimes we're providing more information than they need
Yep.
Yes.
or that they are interested in hearing.
Right.
So if we're just answering and responding to what are those core needs that they're dealing with,
Yes.
we'll gain a lot more, and they'll probably get a lot more comfort out of having their questions answered than just us giving them our information and our thoughts.
And
So
there,
maybe the question we should pose is, what are your concerns as a student upon going back to school?
Or even simpler things if you keep it really open-ended. Like, what are your thoughts about COVID? Something so simple, and then they can, usually if it is school they're worried about, it'll come out of
Right.
that. And the more open-ended you can ask the question, the better response you'll get about what's really bothering them, because otherwise, even if you're keeping it open-ended but a little bit tunneled, like what's your worry about going back to school? Well, maybe their worry is over here, and so then, but if it's just what worries you about COVID, or even what worries you right now, what's going on that worries you? Something so open-ended that they can really get into what it is that they are feeling and what it is that's bothering them.
and I think we have to keep in mind that some kids won't be able to use words. So, especially for younger kids, drawing about it or
Great idea.
making a movie or a song, that might sound silly to some kids, but for other kids, it's a great means of expressing things that they can't say in words.
Or even watching their play, especially if they're doing make-believe, you will
Absolutely.
be amazed at how there's an illness that resembles COVID that is taking
Yes.
over the world. You'll be amazed.
So let me ask you a question then. So in your practice, you're seeing children with anxiety, depression related to this isolation, if you will. And now they're getting ready to go back to school. Is there something that you can offer to the parents or advice that you can give them on how they can work with Arlene's and Rita's that are in the school and letting the school know ahead of time, hey, during the summer or the time we've been away from school, my child really suffered with anxiety and it's a challenge to get them to go back to school. And is there any advice you can offer to parents that are going to be faced with that situation in communicating with the school about their child? Is that a better question to ask you, Arlene?
I think it's a legitimate question for all of us, actually. But I think a lot of it goes back to, if the parent has questions, being informed is one of the ways, but recognizing this is a very fluid process. It's changing every week. It's changing every day. And the school may not have all the answers, but if their child is struggling with maybe some concerns, notifying if they know the classroom teacher, the building counselor, just putting them on the alert of so-and-so is really anxious about coming back. Just kind of keep an eye out for them. Or what can they do if the school, has procedures that they're putting in place regarding what will my classroom look like? Is there an opportunity where they could peek through the window at your building or something of that nature? Most schools are not letting people into the buildings at this time, but there may be some ways to help waylay some of those concerns. But they have to reach out and kind of maybe make the teacher aware, the building counselor, principal, just that there has been some difficulty.
Okay.
And schools are really working very hard in preparation for this school year, whether it's virtual, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's a combination. Last time in the spring, it was really, everything was done on an emergency basis. Everybody was scrambling. I think everybody, most leaders in schools knew that this potential existed, that we would still be facing COVID at the beginning of this school year. And so I would want parents to be reassured that school districts are working very, very hard, not just to meet the educational needs of students and help them maybe catch up, but also they're really looking at the emotional needs of kids. What are we going to do so that we can even be proactive in helping kids make these adjustments whichever way they choose? And I think there are just so many people out there working to not just address the educational needs, but really the mental health needs of our kids through this period of time. So, school counselors are great people to access in addition to teachers, but often the school counselor is the one who has access to the teachers if parents don't know for sure who their child's teachers are.
I think something that's really important for parents to know, though, if you know certain things that are going to trigger your child, and you also know things that are going to calm your child.
Yes.
So that is really important information to give to the school.
Yes.
And the younger the child, sometimes the more important that is, because often little kids will show anxiety by tantrums. And so I think when a child throws a tantrum, the immediate reaction is, oh, you need a timeout, what you're doing is bad. But anxiety in little kids often causes tantrums. And so, if there is something that's a good coping skill for that child when they are crying because of anxiety, and sharing that with the school, I think, can be very helpful, because I think sometimes, teachers have 25 kids in a class, and a child is looking to be what is a tantrum when it's really anxiety, or a tantrum from anxiety. If there is something simple that can be done, I think that can be very helpful for the schools.
So let's elaborate on that a little bit, because that seems like it takes us right into the next topic, which I wanted to discuss, which is, what are some of the signs that parents should look for in a child that may be developing anxiety or depression? What are some of the common signs and symptoms?
What's interesting is sometimes even in teenagers, they're not able to put words to what they're feeling. And so, after an evaluation, you may very well know they have depression and anxiety, but the child may not be able to put words to it. And so sometimes just asking the child or the adolescent, do you feel anxious? Are you depressed? Do you feel sad? Sometimes they're not able to put the word to it, so they can't tell you that. So, a couple things that you want to look for. If this is new, you want to look for a change in baseline behavior. So if all of a sudden they're not sleeping, if all of a sudden before these kids could make decisions just fine, now they're uncertain about every decision. I mean, simple things.
Agonizing to watch them
Yep.
decide.
Do you want peanut butter and jelly, or do you want a hot dog? And it's like, well, which one should I have? Which one will be better? Which one will keep me healthy? It's so they're all of a sudden they're indecisive. All of a sudden their stomach hurts, their head hurts a lot. Those are really common signs of anxiety. If they're becoming irritable when they weren't before and more agitated, everybody, especially in adolescence, likes to say, oh, they're being a teenager. But a lot of times that can be a sign of anxiety or depression, absolutely. And so again, you're looking for these changes in baseline behavior. If they're withdrawing, they're staying in their room, they're not wanting to do the things they normally do, if they seem like they have no energy, if the things they used to really enjoy, going outside and shooting a basketball, and all of a sudden they just have no interest. These are all signs of anxiety and depression.
Again, I think that you've hit many of them, with younger kids, the clinginess,
Tantrums.
in terms of being able to separate, because that is a huge fear for a lot. What if my mommy gets sick? What if my daddy gets sick? And they've maybe even heard their parents say, well, what if I get sick? Who's going to take care of my children? So clinging, being overly clingy. But it really is important that it's a change. It's not your typical baseline behavior. The other one that I've thought of is the inability to get out of the door on time. Sometimes it's lack of organization or an ADHD type thing, but sometimes it's simply they're doing everything they can to not have to go. And that's a time that frequently calling for school help early can really be beneficial, because maybe just simply having the teacher meet the child's car or the child's bus can make a huge amount of difference because it's a familiar face. So that being, they can't remember what to do next. They're always late. They're never on time. And they argue about it all morning long, from the time they get up until it's time to go out the door.
School refusal. Yeah, because a lot of times that's seen as just oppositional behavior, but a lot of times it's just anxiety.
So along that line, when should a parent seek medical treatment, and who should they reach out to first? If you're noticing your child is exhibiting some of the signs that you talked about, some of the symptoms, who should the parent reach out to?
I think that, a conversation with school about what they're seeing to gather more information, or if the child has a babysitter or a daycare. But we have a lot of really good pediatricians in our community, and that if you have a relationship and your child has a relationship with a pediatrician, that's a good early phone call. And they are doing more screenings in those evaluations and able to say to parents, yeah, your child is showing some signs of anxiety or signs of depression. And then they're helping those parents find the right therapist.
Gotcha.
And I like what you're saying about getting information from multiple sources, because kids spend so much time at school.
Yep.
You certainly want to get information there, but your pediatrician is a good source. Babysitters, people that watch your kids at recess, all of those people before you gather that information before you then make any decisions.
And I think one of the important things to look at and ask when you're getting several different sources is you really want to see, are these symptoms interfering with their functioning?
Yes.
If their symptoms are interfering with their functioning at school, at home, at their extracurricular activity, with the daycare, then that really means that it's time that you start to explore treatment. And so I think a pediatrician can be a great place to start. A lot of pediatricians are starting to have therapists in their office, and so which sometimes the therapist can see the kid the same day they see the pediatrician, which is very helpful. Dayton Children's Hospital has something called mental health resource connection. So if you're a parent and you call Dayton Children's and say, connect me to mental health resource connection, they will connect you to that phone number, and that mental health resource connection can give you different options for therapists in your area that will really fit your need and your location and that kind of thing. So I think those are both, great places to start.
And they do a great job of knowing
Yeah.
who's currently taking clients, and what insurances they take. So you, as a parent, you won't spend a lot of time calling places that, has a waiting list of 6 months.
And they also know if certain therapists specialize in certain
Right.
things, so in certain age groups and those kinds of things. So.
And there are many school districts now that are doing partnerships with local community mental health agencies. So it may be possible that they could be seen even in a school setting. It just kind of depends on the district where you're at and if they're providing those services. But there are a number in the Dayton area that provide those mental health-based services at school. I think the other thing to note is, kids who have really profound changes in their sleeping and eating patterns is another thing. I know kids talk to me about, I don't think I slept at all last night, because they're so worked up about coming in the next day. But the importance of gathering that information, I can recall many times walking out to the car to help get a kid into the building. And once they're in, and after some time in my office, they're able to get through the rest of that day. And so that's important for the parent to know, so that you can start identifying, what's that hurdle? What's the hardest part about getting into school? Sometimes it's just physically getting through that front door. And then what are those messages they're telling themselves about? What are they anticipating is going to happen at school? Because it's that what if that creates the anxiety. And a lot of kids who experience that have conjured in their head that there's something far worse than what their actual experience is once they're there.
Yeah, a lot of kids with anxiety come up with these worst case scenarios in their head, and then they just play them over and over and over and over again, and so then the anxiety just builds.
I always tell kids, it's the more you think about it, the brighter and the brighter the light gets, and the more real it. So that's what they start to believe. And sometimes for kids, even having the conversation with school, you might find out that they are having a struggle in the school, and that's why they're not wanting to go. And so you can address the struggle in the school versus, getting engaged with a therapist. And it maybe isn't as big as you think it is once you start gathering information.
So kind of to summarize this segment, it sounds like if your child is undergoing what you perceive as significant changes or even subtle changes that you're aware of, the best thing to do is to see if that is consistent with what you're seeing in school, maybe with their friends, maybe with their friends' parents. Reach out to the school, the counselor or the teacher, and say, hey, I've noticed my child doesn't want to come to school. Is there some misbehavior or something going on in school? And if you feel that the situation warrants further evaluation, to then reach out to the hotline at Children's. That was what again, Kelly?
The Mental Health Resource Connection. So if you just call Dayton Children's and speak with the operator, they can transfer you to that line. But it's the Mental Health Resource Connection.
Or seek out treatment from your pediatrician and get on the right path. Okay.
So I hope you found this information helpful. And if you like it and you find it helpful to you, please share it with as many parents and students as you can. Thanks again for tuning in.